Good evening, everyone. My name is Terrence Griffin, and I am the Director of Alumni Engagement at Rutgers University, Newark. I want to thank you all for being with us this evening. I am pleased to welcome you all to Racial Reckoning, Inequality, and Interdependence: What Jazz and the Arts Can Tell Us About a Way Forward, featuring Professor Wayne Winborne. Professor Winborne is Executive Director of the Institute of Jazz Studies at Rutgers University, Newark, the largest and most comprehensive research facility and archive dedicated to jazz and jazz-related materials in the world. Winborne is also an associate professor in arts, culture, and media, and is a frequent presenter at conferences on issues related to jazz, art and culture, democracy, civic engagement, intergroup relations, and nonprofit management. He has numerous publications and is editor of a 3-book series. Some housekeeping for tonight's event. If you have questions during the presentation, please feel free to submit those in the Q&A option at the bottom right of your screen. After his presentation, we'll do our best to accommodate as many questions as possible. For your convenience, this presentation is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Rutgers Alumni YouTube channel. Following this presentation, you'll receive a link to that channel to be able to view this presentation and others. At this time, it is now my pleasure to turn it over to Professor Winborne.
Thank you very much, Terrence, and thanks to you and Stephanie and all of the folks at the Rutgers Alumni Association for giving me the opportunity to spend a little time with our alums and to talk about some issues that I think are important and that certainly are impacting us today. My students call me Professor, and it's very nice and kind, but you can all call me Wayne, and please call me Wayne. I do want to change one thing that you said. You said that we'll leave time at the end for Q&A, and it's my intention for us to really engage in a conversation and have a back and forth. So that means a couple of things. You can absolutely interrupt me, and if I can always say, "Hang on, I want to make this incredibly important point that I'm just about to give you right now." But if anyone is so moved, by all means, either send a message or jump in and say something. This should really be an exchange. I say that in the context, though, of being a talker, and it's not just because of the academic-y side of me. It goes. My family, we're all talkers, and as a result, we I was raised in the South. I'm a Black man of a certain age, raised in the Southern Black Baptist Church. So what that means is an open mic or an open forum like this, or an open camera that I'm looking into, is always a dangerous thing. You start talking and like 2 hours later, you haven't even gotten to the sermon yet. But I promise you, I'm not going to do that. I'm really going to try and keep it pretty crisp and move through some things. And then, as I say, if you guys don't jump in with questions beforehand, we'll definitely have time to talk a bit about these issues and hopefully learn from one another. I came up with this title, as many of you may know, when you're asked to do these things, or you ask to do these things, one of the first things they want to know is what you're going to talk about and what the title is and all that stuff. And so I came up with this. It's a bit inelegant. I hope you'll forgive me for that. But I wanted to, I have these ideas and some themes that I've been working on and writing and talking about recently, but also over time. Certainly issues I've been studying. And I wanted to pack everything in, which is always a dangerous thing. I titled it Racial Reckoning, Inequality, and Interdependence. And I think those are terms that we're all very familiar with, but they're critical, I think, to sort of understanding where we are and trying to figure out both where we want to be and how we get there. And for me, that second part is what brings in jazz, which I have the great pleasure of being paid to spend my time immersed in, and the arts generally. And it's my belief that jazz specifically, but the arts and artists more generally are important, critically important to our figuring out and solving some of the problems confronting us right now. So with that as sort of a broad introduction, what I thought I'd do is spend a little bit of time talking about our current situation, which we're all very, very aware of, an even shorter amount of time talking about how we got here, the consequences of how we got here, and then, of course, about jazz and the arts, and as I say, engage in a bit of dialogue and discussion. Now, this thing's supposed to move. There we go. So it's no great insight to say that American democracy is in many ways right now a mess. We're struggling in a lot of ways. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Democracy Index. This is, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a measure that was created by the folks who published The Economist magazine. So this is no far left publication, and they rank countries around the world. And prior to probably, I think it was 2008 when we began our slide, we of course would be ranked as a full and functioning democracy. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a second, but the fact that we're not, we're rated as a flawed democracy, and I'll tell you how they define that in a second, is a real statement. And we continue to be ranked as a flawed democracy. On this matter of American democracy being a mess, the Atlantic Monthly, just a year, no, it was 2018, I believe, had a whole series of articles questioning whether or not we were still a democracy, where American democracy was dying. We obviously have issues around income inequality and reduced class movement, which leads to a number of things, including, in my opinion, a bit of despair and hopelessness on the part of a lot of folks in this country. We also have elected officials who are now openly questioning the notion of our being a democracy. Now, let's be clear, we're a representative republic, right? We elect our elected officials who carry out, create laws, and vote for things on our behalf. So we're not a direct democracy in that sense. That is to say, we don't vote on legislation individually, unless, of course, you look at referendums, ballot referendums, and California is one of the leading places that uses that particular system. But the conversations and questions that have been raised around democracy most recently are done so in the context of voting, and really in a very public way, and it's very interesting in my opinion, in a very public way, raising the question of, do we want everyone to vote? Maybe everyone shouldn't vote. This isn't a new issue. It's not a new question. The framers of the Constitution grappled with this, particularly James Madison, who had a real fear of mob rule, but that's another talk. So all of these together speak to sort of the challenges conceptually and practically that are confronting us and confronting our democracy. That democracy index that I was telling you about, it defines a flawed democracy as nations where elections are fair and free and basic civil liberties are honored, but may have issues, media freedom infringement, lack of participation, et cetera, et cetera. Nonetheless, these nations have significant faults in other democratic aspects, including underdeveloped political culture, low levels of participation in politics, and issues in the functioning of governance. And that last one is just a fancy way of saying, in this case, we have a two-party system. Our two parties aren't working together. We don't get a lot of legislation passed because of gridlock. And it's very significant because, again, for the better part of the 20th century, we were both in how we presented ourselves, but I would argue also in actuality, we were leading the globe and proponents of American-style democracy, going to war at times to, at least on the surface, preserve and promote American-style democracy. For us to slide to 25th place out of 165 nations is, and believe me, the nations that are above us are our peers in terms of being first world nations. It's a real challenge, and it speaks to a number of problems that we have and that are confronting us right now. We obviously have a lot of mistrust of democratic institutions. I'm going to kind of speed through this a little bit, but voters feel alienated. People don't feel like their vote counts. There are all manner of studies looking at this, both by academics, but also by journalists and writers and other folks who are concerned about these kinds of things. The Pew Research Center has a number of, they do an annual survey on citizens' trust in federal government and also trust in one another. And we're all struggling with this. And we have a number of adults who say that we don't agree on basic facts about issues and whether or not there's a problem. And this is core. This is core to how a functioning society figures out how to live, work, and play together and apart. So our democracy is struggling. On the economy, everyone is well aware of income stagnation, how our economy was hit over the past 10 years, how the economy has recovered, but significantly many people's lives have been affected. Middle class is defined very differently today than it has been in the past. And in terms of generational class movement, which is critical, I think, to understanding this country and understanding how we perceive one another, there's been a great loss of generational class movement, and that is to say, children making more, having a better life than their parents. And as you can see, only half now earn more than their parents did at a similar age. By comparison, of course, at age 30, 9 out of 10 Americans in 1940 were earning more than their parents had at the same stage. A very simple way of thinking about this is that the vast majority of people, working class, working poor, middle class, even upper middle class folks, have to have both parents working and able to be able to support and keep a stable home. That was not the case. Working class folks in the mid 20th century were very easily able to have one adult working and sustain the family. And of course, for Black households, more recently, we've seen an incredible drop in net worth. So just over the past, within the past 15 years, while white household net worth did drop also, but not nearly as much. All of these things lead to a very difficult and frustrating situation for us. And we see polls that speak to, in some ways, a positive change. That is to say, now a majority of Americans understand and acknowledge some of the discrimination and challenges that are confronting people of color, particularly Black folks. And more recently, a plurality of Americans expressed support for Black Lives Matter. This is a small thing, particularly in a context where in our country we voted twice. As I say to folks, all hope is not lost because we voted twice for an African American to be president. And continuing, we have protests in the street across major cities. It's actually become a factor in the election, of course. What's particularly fascinating to me has to do with the fact that we are again, in a very overt, very public way, confronting the fact that there's been unequal treatment of people, of Black people in this country, by institutions, by individuals, public and private. And many of these protests are being carried out in cities that have very, very small percentages of people of color. It's an interesting phenomenon to think about from all angles, but it's another one that I absolutely find hopeful. And I'll suggest reasons why a little bit later. But you think about Harbor, Maine, Darien, Connecticut, or Topeka, Kansas, or Portland, Oregon. And to be sure, a lot of the protesters are folks who have a number of different interests. There are anarchists out in Portland who are participating in these marches, but the vast majority of folks, and the vast majority of the protests are peaceful, I might add, the vast majority of folks are making a statement about where they stand and where they sit and how they view discrimination at this point in our nation's history. This last one is just also this last little fact I think is interesting, that it say that 23 million people participated in anti-police brutality protests, potentially making it the largest movement in American history. This is no small thing. This is good. This is another way when we talk about civil society and civic engagement and the challenge that a lot of researchers have expressed over the past decades, Americans being apathetic, not participating, the decline of our civic institutions. This is also civic engagement. And the fact that that's happening now, I think, is another sign for hope. It's horrible that it has to happen. It's horrible that the catalyst for it has been the death of many Black men and women. But the fact that so many folks are not standing idly by is something we should feel good about. It also looks like the turnout in this election is going to be extraordinary, despite how difficult we make it to vote. We make it for people to vote in this country compared to other countries, and even honestly compared to some states. Minnesota has very wonderful voter registration rules and policies that facilitate people coming out. Now, how did we get here? I believe that, and you get very little argument from folks on this, that our democracy has been contradictory from its earliest beginnings. When you consider that in 1619, the first assembly of elected representatives in Virginia gathered, the first time in the colonies outside of indigenous peoples who had not totally dissimilar forms of government, but had been here for centuries and governing themselves and meeting and convening and creating laws and rules in a very different way. This was the first assembly of European representatives in the colonies who met. Just 2 weeks later, the first Black folks arrived on these shores in Point Comfort, Virginia. And so the sale of human beings for their labor, along with the first beginnings of elected representatives of democracy, occurred just a couple of weeks within one another. This is, I don't think it's a mistake, and I don't think it's unimportant. It is ironic, but it does speak to how foundational the sale of human beings has been to this nation. Edmund Morgan, an esteemed writer, has said that slavery in the midst of freedom was the central paradox of the birth of America. And he argues that the rapid expansion of opportunities for Europeans was made possible only by the enslavement and exploitation of African and Indian peoples. And this is obviously true. But it's also totally incompatible with what we have been taught and what we tell ourselves and what this nation has put forth globally over the course of the last 3 centuries. This is important. This is extremely important in this notion of centuries. So 150 years later, by the time the founders decided to craft the Constitution, slavery was an economic force in all of the counties, all of the colonies, especially the southern ones. But it was the economic engine of the country. 1850, cotton, which had been a commodity in Europe and in Asia, was now a global commodity. And the U.S. that year began to dominate the world's market. They started at about 8 million pounds produced a year in 1795. And just 11 years later, 80 million pounds in 1806. The British West Indies had been the primary source at that point, certainly for Europe, and the U.S. surpassed it. So this is a critical thing to understand, even in a fairly superficial way. There's a lot of great scholarship over the past 10 years that's looked at the role of cotton and the role of cotton globally in the global economy, but also in the U.S. economy, wherein before historians tended to talk about slavery as a social institution. It only happened in the South, didn't really impact folks in the North and West. And in fact, it was critical to this nation's success economically. There's a great quote from the American cotton planter in 1853. The slave labor must also continue, for it is idle to talk producing cotton for the world's supply with free labor. It has never yet been successfully grown by voluntary labor. And it's one of the reasons that economists argue that the U.S. Exceeded even India and even parts of Latin America. Brazil was a major producer. But our slave system here was so efficient from an economic standpoint that it allowed the U.S. to surpass others. By 1860, 80% of our country's GDP was linked to slavery. This is all of this is important, I think, to set the stage for understanding how do we understand where we are. Some historians have argued that Virginia's, and I was born and raised in the great Commonwealth of Virginia. I love it dearly, and I love the South with all of its mess and beauty and wonder and terror. It's complicated and complex, like most of us are. Historians have argued that because when Virginia very early on adopted slavery and dispossession of native peoples, it reinforced stereotypes and racist attitudes and began centuries of discriminatory processes. I disagree with that. I think, in fact, it was the adoption that necessitated discriminatory processes. We had to have it. They had to develop theories about Black people and Native people and others in order to maintain the great profits and success that resulted from this labor. That necessity grew and was reinforced over the course of the next century and a half before the founding of the country. How else do people who are fleeing oppression justify and live with oppressing other humans? There wasn't a misunderstanding that these were human beings, although people promulgated that. There wasn't an understanding that there was genius evenly distributed between and among these people. Folks knew that. This country needed the success and power that came from the profits to mask the contradictions and problems that have always existed. Had we not been so economically successful, I suspect that the arguments and conversations about freedom and equality would be very different, just as they are today. There would have been a racial reckoning. There have been times in the past when people called the question, and there have been attempts to answer it. If you look closely at Reconstruction, that 12-year period, that very brief period, was extraordinary for some of the things that happened in this country. But it was also extraordinary for the pushback, for the extreme reactions to squelch it, to stop what, in fact, I believe would have been a natural coming together and natural carving of a new path for this country. What I argue is that generations of Americans have continued and lived with these contradictions and helped along by material success and wealth, all the while sensing, knowing, feeling that there's a reckoning coming. Douglas warned that no republic is safe that tolerates a privileged class or denies to any of its citizens equal rights and equal means to maintain them, and he fought for it and argued, particularly during Reconstruction. But of course, the Jim Crow era followed. So living and tolerating, embracing this hypocrisy, I believe, has carried a terrible price. It requires lying across generations. And let me quickly just say, I keep talking about generations and I talk about centuries of this because we really have to think about the impact of that. What does that mean? What does that mean to create myths? Not good myths, but myths about people, about what actually went on here, about the fact that this land was populated, populated with people who were functioning, living, had been here, who had a completely different concept of their relationship to the land. And I suspect, I don't know what it's like to bargain, to offer to purchase land from people who don't have a concept of owning land. Like, what did they think was going on? I wonder about that. How have centuries of living with the inherent contradictions of racism and discrimination impacted white people in this country? And I believe we know some of the answers. I believe we have some of the answers to that question in front of us. One way is that dehumanizing other humans who aren't close to or who don't look like you creates the space to dehumanize other people who are near you and who do look like you. And this is true for human beings across the board. In other words, the history of enslaving people vicious racial discrimination over the course of centuries, and having to lie repeatedly about it have led to a kind of spiritual and emotional corrosion. And I think people feel it. They may not talk about it in terms of a collective unconscious or a collective impact over centuries, but I think that's the reason, if we go back and look at Bar Harbor, Maine, Des Moines, Iowa, Portland, this is why there is such dissatisfaction. Folks now see and understand that they've been lied to during their lifetime. I don't know if they think consciously about what's occurred over generations, but I think there is a cumulative impact. There's no question in my mind. I can throw some psychological theories at you and talk about Carl Jung and his notion of the collective unconscious, but we don't need to do that, other than to say that it's hard to argue that centuries of doing something here doesn't impact people today. If you just look at the positive, when people talk about we've been doing this for centuries, we've been farmers in my family for centuries. There are conscious and unconscious messages that are encoded in that. And I think the same has been true for this. The good news is that many white people today, especially young people, are saying they simply do not want to participate in this lie anymore. I think that's why you see folks demonstrating so much. And as I said, there's a lot of emerging scholarship and understanding about all of these issues coming at them from different angles. Eduardo Porter and Jonathan Metzl are just two who have written recently and argued that racial hostility is at the root of many of our policies that unfortunately hurt white people. Sorry for that typo, especially working and poor white people. That's supposed to be Ann. They talk about Jonathan Metzl's book is Dying of Whiteness. It's a bit dense, but I recommend it primarily because he mixes obviously data and also conversations. Yeah, he's a psychiatrist in the South, I believe, Kentucky, and he talks about encountering people who would rather suffer than participate in Obamacare, which he says to them, if you had Obamacare, you would have been in the hospital 9 months ago. You might not be dying of this disease. And the man says, that's okay. I'd rather die than support a policy that's going to benefit undeserving people like Black folks and immigrants. This is a very profound statement on the part of this person. And it speaks to what some folks have called our lack of compassion for one another. If you look at our fellow democracies and first world nations around the country, every one of them has a much, much, much broader social safety net for its members than do we. And part of the argument Eduardo Porter makes in American Poison is that dehumanizing and creating stereotypes and myths to justify racism against fellow citizens, other human beings who happen to have darker skin, not all the time, but many times, allows people then do the same or variations or gradations of the same to one another. That's the emotional corrosion, I think. And I believe that many people recognize this, if not consciously, just below consciousness, and are fighting very hard against this. As I say, young people understand this and are very clear that, put in other terms, we've allowed the confluence of capitalism, of globalism, and technology, and the accelerated effects of all of those to circumvent our stated values and to dominate virtually everything we do. This was true 2 centuries ago. The cotton gin was advanced technology at the time and literally changed the ability of plantation owners to produce much, much, much more cotton, putting money in a lot of different pockets, from the shipping industry in New England to the rum and sugar trade, obviously into the sale of human beings for that free labor. I would also argue that at the same time that that's happening, it's depressing the wages, of course, of white working class and non-plantation owning folks in the South, because of course, why they pay some white guy minimum wage when they can get me to work for free? And again, the economic engine that cotton and slavery was to this country, is just now becoming fully clear and understood by a larger number of people. White Americans are suffering in a lot of ways. I won't go through all of this, but again, Jonathan Metzl and others talk about this. Gun suicides, if you look at small towns in rural America, it is not uncommon to find 25, 30, 40% of the population to be either incarcerated because of drug use, particularly methamphetamines, or to be addicted to methamphetamines. There's one town where something like 60, these are 99% white towns, by the way, 60% of the males are either in jail or out on parole, all of it related to the use of methamphetamine. This is a not so silent epidemic and challenge in this country. And it speaks to a level of despair and frustration because the economy has not worked for them. And yet none of those folks are talking about class warfare. A disproportionate number of those folks, of course, believe that the problem in this country has to do with immigrants or Black people or people on welfare or women not being in the home, or pick the cultural war that's been thrown up over the past 3 or 4 decades to explain it, when obviously that's not the case. White Americans also have as do many of us who aren't white, a distorted view of public assistance. And 25% of whites accept that white people are the main beneficiaries of the welfare state. Tax credits and government assistance program benefited 6.2 million whites without college degrees versus 2.8 million Blacks and 2.4 million Hispanics. It's not to say that there isn't a disproportionate impact for people of color, but numerically, the numbers have always been clear. Some 40% of whites white households between 18 and 64, where no one in the home has a Bachelor of Arts degree, had someone on public assistance. That's a knock on public assistance. That has to do with that same population is one that has disdain for people who are receiving government assistance and perceive them to be the problem. So what does all of this have to do with jazz? Now that I have almost certainly depressed all of you, I hope not, but I do hope it's been, if you didn't already know this stuff, that it's been an awakening of sorts. What does this have to do with jazz and the arts? Jazz has been called America's greatest contribution to the art world. It's been called America's classical music, its greatest global contribution. It is widely understood to have come out of the deep humanity of a people struggling against an inhumane treatment and an expression of hope, longing, and perseverance. It's a music that from its inception has reflected the past, present, and future. Black folks were drawing upon memories of Africa, conscious and unconscious memories of Africa, and yet melding them into the experiences here on this soil, and looking forward to something better, something brighter. Jazz historian Ted Gioia, who has, in my opinion, the definitive book on jazz history, uses a phrase I love. He called the development of jazz an actual transfer of totally African ritual to the native soil of the New World. I love that. In the period of its earliest development in New Orleans, this is to say when jazz was at it's the early substrates of jazz in the 18th century, he calls it the beginning of the Africanization of American music. I love that phrase. I think it's apt as well. In these ways, jazz illustrates core aspects of America, melding of cultures, hope, the hopefulness of people who have little practical reason to have any, and the continual forward gaze, striving for something and someplace better. This notion of hope, I just want to say, just add a little extra thing on that. Hope is a very deep and profound concept. It's closely tied to, I think, musically the blues. That's another talk, but it's important to think about hope. Cornel West talks about hope and says that hope is not optimism. Optimism is when you look out and you go, oh, okay, there's one or two things. Oh, I see some signposts. There's some reasons for me to feel pretty good about where things are going. Hope is when you look out and there is no reason at all to feel good, to get up and go tomorrow, to strive, to fight, but do it anyway. You get up and do it anyway. And that's been a critical feature of African Americans and of many people, not just African Americans, but particularly African Americans, in moving forward and surviving. Um, Jazz is often referred to as a metaphor for democracy, with this notion of the interplay between the individual and the collective, the soloist and the group. I argue that similarly, at best, democracy searches for an equilibrium between individual rights and opportunities in the common good. So here we are. I'm striving to do as well as I can to make as much as I can, if that's the case. But I also have to think about the common good. I have to think about commonwealth. I have to think about the public square where we can all come together and deal with one another as equals. Um, and I love that concept. Like Jazz, democracy asks that we consider others as much as we might consider ourselves, that we treat that shared goal as seriously as we treat our personal ones. And sometimes we stay in the background and let the other soloists shine. Um, Democracy, like Jazz, requires patience, diligence, commitment, and maybe most importantly, a willingness to admit and learn from past mistakes. It requires a deep attention to history and tradition at the same time, and keeping right next to that attention to history and tradition, a willingness to move past both and even challenge them, but thoughtfully, but still challenge them. Both jazz and democracy require a great deal of trust, empathy, and belief in an outcome that is yet to come. Both require experimentation and a lot of work done individually as a precursor. Have to you have to practice your instrument before you go to make this music. And I think we have to educate ourselves before we come fully prepared to participate in democracy. That doesn't get talked about enough these days. The responsibilities on citizens, and the responsibility we have to one another, to understand how our laws work, to understand where we might intervene, to understand that we're in a fluid situation, and and we have to challenge ourselves. That doesn't get talked about enough, but it's an incredibly important feature of democracy at its best. Both jazz and democracy require a collective imagination by its participants and a shared commitment to work together towards a mutually beneficial goal. This notion of collective imagination, I think, is very important. Again, we are trying to get to something that we hope is there, that we imagine to be there, that we've envisioned, but we don't quite know. And that's where the trust in one another comes. Let me speed up because I'm looking at my clock. Oh God, I've been talking too much. I'm going to speed up, you guys, but this part is important, I think. So jazz and the arts are the engine of our collective imagination, our internal world, ideas of hope. Um, Jazz and the arts allow us to make that inferential step from what is to what can be. Peter Murphy writes extensively about the collective expression of the imagination in our cities, in our political systems, economies, universities, as well as in everyday life. He argues that creativity in this context is the marrying of opposites, the ability to see one thing as another. And that's precisely what artists do as a matter of course, and what they provoke in us. Engaging our collective imagination, I believe, is critical for us to confront and begin to solve and move through our current problems. We have to be able to envision what's necessary to make a different world. Our collective imagination allows us, both individually, but more importantly, as a society, to ask what I think is a very, very powerful question. What if? What if we decided, for example, that being wealthy really meant just having enough? What if I had enough and I thought of myself as a wealthy person? What if we really understood that race is a social construct? We say that a lot, and I feel like it's now it's in the common vernacular enough that most people will understand what you're talking about. That wasn't the case 40, 50 years ago. But this notion of race is a social construct. But what if we really understood that? What does that mean? It's a social construct. It's not biological. It's not necessarily complexion. Now, what if we really understood that whiteness is not a biological circumstance, but rather a category that one could choose to step out of and away from? A lot of anti-racist practitioners talk about rejecting whiteness. And when you go and read what they talk about, it becomes very clear if you haven't thought about what whiteness is. And it's very hard. It has been understudied and sometimes very hard to define. At one point, the easiest definition of whiteness was not black. That's certainly how it emerged as a definition here in the United States and these colonies. And I definitely encourage you, if you haven't, to read Nell Irvin Painter's classic book, The History of White People. It's just extraordinary. And it will challenge, it will force you to rethink some notions. You know, the idea that, you know, prior to, if you go back to antiquity and human history, you know, prior to life in this country, it's not clear that people we consider to be white walked around thinking of themselves as white. At least in the written record, there's very little evidence to support that. They identified themselves as different. You know, they saw themselves as Scythians or Romans, or and they certainly had the institution of slavery unapologetically. The Greeks were very, very clear about it, and they didn't not see physical difference. They talked about it all the time. They just don't seem to have identified themselves or other now white people as white. That construction came along with, surprise, surprise, the need for free labor in this country. And so what if white people rejected whiteness and all of its attendant benefits? What if white folks, majority of them, or a lot of folks said, that's it, I'm going to step away from this? What does that mean? What does that look like? I think there's some very concrete implications of that, and I think they're incredibly potentially powerful. What does that mean for neighborhoods? What does that mean for how we tolerate discriminatory acts that we see, large and small? Not just microaggressions, but actual discriminatory acts. Let's flip it around. I like to, whenever I get on stuff like this, or I'm like, I don't know if this is really working for me as I think through or read something, I like to try, it's always helpful to put on another lens because it shifts my particular sense of self and identity. If we take a quick gender lens on this, we can think about this. How many of us men have participated silently or actively in conversations where women were disparaged? If you go to a barbershop, there's no question you heard some stuff that was misogynistic, sexist, and horrible. How many people jumped up and said, no, that's not cool? How many people walked out? How many of us have done that? I dare say that most of us have, right? That's a very easy way. But when you think about it and surface that, it raises a very interesting question with respect to what if we rejected that? You know, I used to say to friends of mine who are African American who live in either Cleveland or Washington, it's like, man, I don't know how you walk around with that insignia on your chest. You know, the Cleveland Indians baseball team logo is horrific. I mean, that's, and friends of mine would say, well, it's a dignified picture. I was like, yeah, but have you talked to anybody who's Native American and see what they think? What if that face were black and Afro? What if the Cleveland Indians made that a black face? I've often said to them that black people wouldn't even have to organize and demonstrate. White citizens would say, absolutely not, can't do it. But we allow that to happen because Native peoples have not had a voice in this conversation, and they've been, their needs have been passed over, right? So flipping that lens helps us, I think, get a slightly different perspective. And then you go back to the what if. What if we decided that our highest purpose as human beings, the reason we're here, is to take care of one another? What if we're true? What does that mean? I don't think it means that you know, the next person you see, you pass on the street. I live in Newark, live downtown, which I love very much. And so there's a mix of folks. It doesn't mean that I don't think it means that the next time I pass someone who's struggling on the street, that I like empty my bank account, right? But it does mean that I consider them. I consider their humanity. And maybe the next time someone suggests that we, I don't know, raise our taxes by 0.25% to fight poverty in this city, maybe I say, you know what, 4%, I can live with that. I can live with 0.5%. Maybe I can live with 5%. I don't know. Maybe it means that I go volunteer at the church that has a feeding program around the corner. Maybe I donate something to them. I stop and talk to that person? I don't know. I don't know. That's the thing about it. It creates so much possibility. And artists and jazz musicians in particular live in that space of creating possibility, of exploring, of challenging themselves. And they can be helpful to us. What if, oh, I apologize, you guys, so much. I'm gonna, this has to do with the 1619 Project, and it has to do with embracing people who have been left out of this American equation. Nicole Hannah Jones, what if America understood finally in its 400th year that we have never been the problem but the solution? I love that because it speaks to a number of things that we see in this country. She's talking about African Americans, but it's not just limited to African Americans, but we're, I think, a very good example of it. What if people who have been excluded from the democratic process, from having a stake in saying who's American, what if these folks were actually believed in and committed to the good myths about America more than the folks who are here? And I think we see evidence of it all over the place, but it's happened historically. Um, there's the example in the 1790s, a group of New Yorkers who were locked in debtor's jail. Yes, they used to be not so different from today, prison for just being poor. While they were in jail, they adopted their own version of the Constitution and they governed themselves, even though they were in prison. Free Black folks in the North and enslaved Blacks in the post-war South were more likely to create and participate in civic groups than were their white neighbors. Women used charitable societies and ladies' auxiliaries to join in public debates and eventually to secure the right to vote. Even though they weren't allowed to vote at that time, they're fighting for it, they're participating in it. All of these folks understood and believed deeply in democracy and the ability of citizens to come together. So I'm gonna, I think you get what I'm saying. I usually close with, when I'm talking about this kind of stuff, I talk about South Africa. I spent time and have projects going on there. They have a concept of Ubuntu. I'll just tell you this. Roughly translated, it is, I am what I am because of who we all are. I am what I am because of who we all are. I think that's a very profound and subtle concept. I don't exist as human. To be human means to be a part of a group, to be connected. You cannot be human by yourself. We are taught to think so much of ourselves as individuals separated from one another when really we're connected. We're dependent upon one another. The treatment of enslaved Black folks and the discrimination that followed and the unfair treatment across the board to many other folks, including by class, has eroded all of us, even the people that supposedly benefited and overtly have benefited. But in fact, we see today, and we are at this inflection point, we see that the core has been rotted. And I believe to my core that particularly young people today, at a deep level, see this contradiction and are fighting against it, railing against it, even when they don't exactly know how to, what should come next or how to get there. I think that's where we come. I think those of us who are older are not exempt from this conversation. We need the energy and impatience of young people, but we bring something to the table too. I talk about it elsewhere here, but I'm going to read through this. These are just some examples of art, in my opinion, that is both provocative and deep and doing exactly, opening our minds. This is a statue in Richmond, again, in my beautiful Commonwealth of Virginia. This is called Monument Row. You guys may have heard about it. This is very recent. This is a statue of Robert E. Lee. The photographer has projected an image of Breonna Taylor and Black Lives Matter onto that statue. And this is very, you can imagine in my great state, people are losing their minds, you know. What a very interesting juxtaposition, and what does it make you think about? I'm not one who thinks that we should act like the past didn't happen and that we should hide things away. We should put it in context and we should learn from it. And to have this juxtaposition is incredibly interesting and provocative. And I think it creates pathways for us to be together. I'm going to stop there and see if Stephanie or Terrence if people have questions. And it's 68. I apologize. I really didn't intend to talk that long. I was going to speed through some of this. But let me just see if folks have anything else to say. If you don't, I have some other artwork and some music I can play for you as well.
Yeah, so we have one question right now, and folks, feel free to use the Q&A option at the bottom right of your screen to submit questions. And this question here is a little bit related to the image that you just shared. And the question is, can you talk about a time when jazz or the arts was most effectively used as a form of activism, and what was its impact?
So, well, the arts generally is, you know, always, but let's talk about jazz. So for me, artists, art does a number of things. You know, it can be a balm in Gilead. It could be something that's just soothing. I just want to chill. I don't know if you all could hear the music that was playing at the beginning. I was just playing something off of my playlist. That playlist is called Chill Me. And I picked some things that are just very soothing and easy. It happens to be a Quincy Jones tune. When he was writing, Quincy Jones was probably in his early 20s, mid 20s, or something like that. He had been arranging and writing for Count Basie and other big bands. And he wrote this song for Lena Horne, had married her husband, Lenny Hayden, who was an arranger, very respected and well known arranger. And he wrote that song for Lena and Lenny. And I find it just very soothing, right? So music and the arts can do that. Music and the arts can also energize and innervate you. It can make you angry. It can, I think, at its best, it can reflect and refract what you're experiencing human emotion, both on an individual level, but also on a collective level. And great art always does that. Great art will evoke different emotions in you at different points of time in your history, at different places where you are. So, with respect to movements, jazz music generally has been critical. Jazz has been important. Let me also say that one of the things that art, I talked about art allowing us to make an inferential step between what is to what can be. Art generally, and jazz in particular, um, can open up pathways and help us understand things that we can't grasp literally. It's part of the reasons I believe humans have developed metaphors. And we dream in metaphor because sometimes our conscious mind has a hard time moving away from logic. We're sort of hardwired to look for certain things. So you have Charles writing a song called Fables of Faubus in the 60s for Arkansas governor, Arkansas, Mississippi, Mississippi, Governor Arvis Faubus, who tried to keep black kids from going to school, literally, and of course, call out the National Guard, Arkansas. Um, you have Max Roach and Abby Lincoln collaborating. They were married at the time, but collaborating on a seminal jazz record in 1959 called "We Insist," the Freedom Now Suite. And there is one tune on that in particular, that triptych, and it's in three parts: prayer, protest, and peace. And it is a searing piece. It will, it if it's possible to do it musically without words, it encapsulates the civil rights movement and the emerging Black Power struggle. People have used jazz and music to organize, to attract folks, to bring clarity to issues. Concretely, you have Rasan Roland Kirk leading a movement of musicians who literally, literally wormed their way into the audience of certain shows, including the Dick Cavett show. I think they did the Tonight Show when Johnny Carson wasn't the host, because it was, I want to say, it wasn't Steve Allen. Oh my God, I'm forgetting who was the host of the Tonight Show before Steve Allen. But wormed their way into the audience, and at a designated moment stood up and started shouting, blowing whistles, rattles, and demanding that the networks put more Black artists on. The television at that point, you know, it was a very shared national experience. I think there were only three stations, one UHF station. And so an incredible proportion of Americans were watching the same shows. Ed Sullivan Show, these talk shows, as I said, Dick Cavett. I think Merv Griffin, too, had a nighttime show, maybe an afternoon show at that point. But these were musicians who organized, fighting for artists, not just jazz musicians, right? They wanted Black artists generally, but particularly jazz artists to be on television. They understood what that exposure meant to folks' careers. So there are a lot of examples. You can go back even further. And if you look at protest music, folk music, obviously Pete Seeger is a key figure there. If you look at in 1939, Billie Holiday performing "Strange Fruit," which originated as a poem written by a man who was Jewish, by the way, and later set to music by him and others, and it became Billie Holiday's signature song. Um, to the point that there were folks who demonstrated, who protested outside of clubs where she performed it. She was asked not to perform it by the head of the narcotics division of, it wasn't the FBI, it was the Federal Narcotics, whatever it was called, a person who hounded her the rest of her life and contributed mightily to her early passing when she refused to not perform Strange Fruit with this images of lynching and what it aroused in people, right? So the music has played a critical role. I think it plays a critical role today. I don't know that it's quite the same, but I know that there are a lot of artists who are waking up to this, and this is music that I don't necessarily listen to. It may not be something that I'm deeply immersed in, but I think there are a lot of younger artists. Certainly Beyonce, I think, who is a preeminent artist right now. I don't even know what to call it. She's more than a singer. She's evolved beyond that. But she's playing a critical role, I think, in challenging notions of place, of race, of hierarchy, of gender. And there are others like that. So I hope that answered the question.
Absolutely. There was another one that came in that talked about how jazz um, in the past or even more recently has been used to challenge norms and challenge racism. And you talked a little bit about it towards the end of your response there. So I think that you were good and thorough in responding to that. Shifting gears a little bit here, we have another question that talks about education. Uh, you know, how do we get school districts to understand the importance of art education, jazz, music, theater, dance, etc., and establishing the mindset at an early age?
So, what's funny, I think I would be shocked if educators uh, had to be convinced about the importance and the role of the arts in education. We have to be convinced about it. Arts and music, along with other extracurricular activities, have come out of the schools because we're unwilling to pay the money to support it. I mean, we need to have these conversations. If we didn't tie uh, taxes that go to pay for schools, what if we didn't tie them to homes? They're tied to real estate taxes. What if we had conversations about, look, what, how much money do our schools need, right? How do we do this, right? Can we pool our money? We're part of a state and we're a poor county. Can we work with people who live in another county at the state level and agree that here's what our schools need at a minimum, and here's we're all going to pony up for that. That's the conversation we have to have, by the way. People only talk about spending too much on schools when it comes to middle, working poor, and poor school districts. Wealthy folks spend tons of money on schools. I mean, there's, you know what I mean, they have like cutting edge everything, and they have the best arts programs, and as well they should, right? We've been, I think, duped into thinking that this is not a priority and that's something that we should pay for. And I think it is. And I think we need to talk about it collectively. So I don't think the struggle is with the school districts. I think the struggle is with us, with people who have kids and don't have kids together. And I think we need to really grapple with, um, you know, what we think is important, what kind of investment we make. Do I want the same for my kids as someone else who doesn't make as much money as me? Do I want the same opportunities for someone else's kid? Do I want them to have access to the same foods, to have the number of chances that my kid had, that I want for my kid? These go back to my thing about our the need for empathy between and among us, and what has kept us from having empathy for for each other, and how we develop it. This notion of what if, What if we all decided we want the best for other people's kids that we want for our own? What if we did that? It's a very wealthy nation. What if, as opposed to saying, "Oh my God, we can't tax people at this," what if we said, what if wealthy folks, those of us who are fortunate, said, "Wow, I need enough. I don't need much more than that. I need enough." And what's enough? And the rest of that can go to helping all of us. I mean, I think the possibilities are limited. And the good news is, by the way, people have done this. We know this. We know the possibilities of this. We do. We know this. We know what investing in young people can give us. We know what investing in infrastructure and education can give us. Right? We know this. When before the New Deal, before the New Deal, in the early half of the 20th century, taxes on the wealthy, the maximum tax rate on the wealthy was something crazy. I don't know, like 75%, wealth tax on stuff. There were still wealthy people. Rich people were still richer than everybody else. Rockefeller had a bigger house than everybody else. It didn't, people did not go to work because there were constraints placed on how much people could make and and some constraints on what they could do with it. And I think it's a conversation we need to have. I love. There was a group. I think it's still around. Bill Gates' father was part of a group of wealthy, extremely wealthy folks who were saying, "No, we can be taxed at a higher level. We'll be fine." I think that's such an important conversation for wealthy folks to have, to ask themselves, "What's enough? What's enough?" I don't. I'm not trying to turn us into, a communist state where we just take money from folks. I want us to have the conversation collectively. I would love for us to come to a shared understanding. Somebody's going to have a bigger house and more cars than I do. That's totally cool, right? But in this country, having a place to live should not be a question. In this country, having basic subsistence should not be a question. We have the means to do it. We have the wealth to do it.
Thank you. Another question here. We have two more questions. I'll do one and then we'll see if we have time for the last one. How can art organizations best collaborate around funding as well as programming to ensure their mutual survival? And being as though you, of course, work for Rutgers Newark and live in Newark, what are some of the community organizations that you would recommend? Some jazz programs that you would recommend?
Oh, so that's a great question. I assume you mean from an education standpoint. This is interesting. We have a really extraordinary ecosystem that is growing, and several of us intend to help continue to make it grow and strengthen it. So we recently hired Stefan Harris as faculty in the music department. Stefan is a five-time Grammy-nominated musician, composer, band leader, thought leader, app developer, um, brilliant. He's been called one of the most important musicians of his generation. I think he's the most important musician of his generation. Uh, he left the Manhattan School of Music, one of the premier conservatories in this country, believe me. Juilliard, Manhattan School, Oberlin. He left them to come here to join us at Rutgers Newark because of this ecosystem and to bring his knowledge and this revolutionary way of teaching music, both to elite musicians, but also to regular folks. Um, and so part of that ecosystem, Rutgers Newark, I would include us, WBGO, our nation's premier jazz radio station, the New Jersey Performing Arts Center under the leadership of John Schreiber, brilliant. And that is an art center that we have to, I'm crossing my fingers, we have to help survive. There are a lot of smaller mid-range art centers that I fear are not going to make it. And then moving down, there's Arts High School here who have some wonderful ensembles. If folks are looking to support something or looking for extracurricular activities, they do have some ensembles where I think students from other schools can participate. Jazz House Kids, created by Melissa Walker, led by her, is one of the, I don't know, two or three best jazz education programs for middle and high school students. NJ Pack's Jazz for Teens is also one of the best. So there's a real ecosystem. If you're looking for artists to jazz musicians to study privately with or to have lessons with, you should. Terrence will give folks my email. You can email me, and I can make some recommendations to you. In terms of collaborating, I think the way you do it is you have to be willing and open. Um, be clear about the strengths that your organization has, both the resources that you have, both human and financial, and then look for strategic partners. Look for unlikely partners, I would say to you. All the things I'm talking about, I think we all have to model. I teach a class, an intro to music class, and at the beginning, I'll ask my students what their experience is with music, what do they like, what do they listen to. And I was telling them that, in return, I was telling them about myself, as is my mainstream. I love all kinds of music. I was telling them how I had been listening to some country music, and there's a couple of performers that I love, and a subgenre, sometimes called mountain soul. The students, oh, I don't like country music. I said, I hear you. I said, I'm not trying to change what you like. I said, but I want you to listen to it and listen to it again, and I want you to understand it. Because I believe that if you do that, you will see the commonalities and the similarities between the music. I mean, Mountain Soul is precisely that. And if anybody's interested, check out Ralph Stanley, who is great, great, great singer. He passed away recently, but a great singer and so full of emotion and communicating. As a singer I know said, Wayne, it's all the same church. It's just different pews. So I'm saying all of that to say, be strategic and thoughtful about the organizations that you look to and reach out to. There may be organizations that you wouldn't think to partner with, but they bring something to the table that you don't, and it'll expand what you like and what you think of. Again, you have to be clear about your strengths and weaknesses as an organization. And then there was another part of the question. So collaborating in Newark. Oh, who in Newark? The easiest thing I can tell you here in Newark is go to Newark Arts website. Newarkarts.org, I believe. They are the umbrella organization for all of the arts organizations here in the city. We have a nice range of folks who are doing all kinds of things, from community organizing to glass blowing, to printmaking, design, and of course, music. There's a hip hop activist community here. I think that's been really interesting and important, and of course, jazz. As a mainstream here in the city.
Great. Before we close, I just wanted to ask you one final question of you. Seeing as though you're the executive director of the Institute of Jazz Studies, is there anything that you would like to share with those who have attended tonight about the Institute, or any exciting news that you'd like to share?
I thank you, Terrence. See, this is the thing. I should have been better at this. I should have had a commercial prepared. So thanks for that opening. Yeah, we're very proud of the Institute of Jazz Studies. As Terrence said at the beginning, we are the largest research facility and archive dedicated to jazz in the world. We have a non-circulating library of some, whatever it is, 3,000 books, journals, articles, periodicals. We've got some 7,000 images, print and moving, and roughly everything that's ever been recorded commercially in jazz. We've got collections from Benny Carter. We've got memorabilia, Mary Lou Williams' complete collection, Abby Lincoln's complete collection, not Dick Katz, blanking on the arranger's name. We recently acquired the Count Basie collection, which is our flagship and centerpiece. Count Basie was a New Jersey native, an incredibly important musician, both to jazz, but also to rock and roll and blues, Kansas City style music. When we're open, you can come in and tour the archives and take a look at Ella Fitzgerald's favorite gown, her favorite wig, videos of her performing in that gown and wig. We've got one of Miles Davis's trumpets, Don Bias's tenor saxophone, on and on. We're a treasure trove for researchers and scholars and grad students, but also for regular folks. We have listening rooms where you can come in and listen to things from 1935 or your favorite John Coltrane record. We're of course closed now, but we hopefully will be back up and running like we all are. We also have Chico Marrow, who's a legend in Latin jazz. We have his complete collection. We have not displayed that yet, but we hope to. So we need support, of course. Part of what I do is raise funds. We recently received a wonderful grant, prestigious grant from the federal government to preserve the Count Basie collection. As you can imagine, Basie died in the late 80s, 88 or 89, I believe. Um, and so we need to preserve all of the materials that we have. And he fortunately kept a lot of stuff, everything, ledgers, playbills, his Grammy Awards. He was the first African American to win a Grammy Award, by the way. And this is a wonderful grant. It's the total will be $1 million, but we have to, it's just under $500,000, which we have to match. It's a one-to-one match. I've got to raise that money. So if folks are interested and at all curious, we certainly looking for donations, but we really want your engagement and involvement. So check us out. Last thing I'll say is I'm also, I'm a kid in a candy store with my particular job. We have a jazz club on campus, Clements Place, and we do a cross section of programming. We bring in some big names, but we also have programming that features local artists, young and emerging artists. We've partnered with some of the other music schools around the area and provided space for their students to perform in a jazz club setting, which a lot of students don't have the opportunity to do so. We have a jam session in partnership with the New Jersey Performing Arts Center. So you can also help us support the ongoing running of that jazz club. That club is free. Chancellor has raised the to support that. I've raised a little bit. She raised a lot. We hope to continue to do that, and we want it to remain free because we want the community to come and feel like it is their space. So we're always looking for partners and looking for support. If it's not material or financial, we love the support anyway. We love the interest, and we want to promote this music. We want to promote community, and we want to find a way to uplift all of us. So thanks for that opportunity, Terrence. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
One last thing.
Sure.
This is an excerpt of a poem. This is Langston Hughes's. And I just had a part of it just because America was never America to me. And I just put a part of it. And just because this is another example of an artist, in this case, a poet. And it's so, for me, it's just so American. Langston Hughes was on a train. He was, I think his mother was either ill or she passed away. I think he was ill, but he's heading home back down to the South. So he's on a train. And a train where, leaving New York, heading back to the South, and I want to say Alabama, I should know this, I apologize. But he's heading south, and he's on a train where, once he crosses the Mason-Dixon line somewhere in Delaware, he's going to have to move to the back of the train, right? And he wrote this poem, America Was Never America to Me, right? And that obviously doesn't resonate for folks who have felt, disenfranchised and disconnected. But I was so struck by, look who he includes. When you read this, America be a land where liberty is crowned with no false patriotic greed, but opportunity is real and life is free. Equality is in the air we breathe. And then here's the refrain: there's never been equality for me. But ask the question, who are you that's mumbling in the dark? And who are you that draws your veil across the stars? And look who he names on this train where he have to move to the back, right? I am the poor white, fooled and pushed apart. I am the Negro bearing slavery scars. I am the red man driven from the land. I am the immigrant clutching the hope I seek and finding only the same old stupid plan of dog eat dog, of mighty crush the weak. I am the young man, full of strength and hope, tangled in that ancient, endless chain of profit, power, gain, of grab the land. And he goes on, I'm the farmer, bondsman to the soil. I'm the worker, so I am the Negro, servant to you all. I am the people, humble, hungry, mean. Hungry yet today, despite the dream. Beaten yet today, oh pioneers. I am the man who never got ahead, the poorest worker, bartered through the years. Yet I'm the one who dreamt our basic dream in the old world. And he goes on to talk about how hopeful he is. And he swears that he's going to fight to let America be what it's supposed to be. I just think it's an extraordinary achievement and an extraordinary expression of humanity.
and something that, again, helps pose the question for us. What if we felt that way? If he can feel that way in that context, what if we all did? What might we do together? So anyway, just wanted to leave you with that.
Thanks for that. On behalf of the RUAA, I want to thank you, Wayne, for being with us tonight. Thanks to the attendees. I'll leave this up here. I think this is a very timely and timeless sentiment, and I think it's a great way to end tonight's presentation. So thanks again, and thanks to everyone. Have a great evening.